Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
T.L. Taylor, a professor sociologist at MIT in Comparative Media Studies.
and MIT is Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. There was a time I did not know what it was, believe me.
Well, I think we were all born not knowing what MIT was, right? It's just a matter of when
Of
we
course.
find out.
Yeah.
Eventually, we all find out. Prof, thanks for being here. And I wanted to ask you to begin with my standard question, which is to inquire what's currently impeding, dynamizing, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on for T.L. Taylor?
Well, I will tell you what has been occupying me. I spent several hours a couple days ago making stickers that I'm taking to a fan convention on Thursday around Disney's Galactic Star Cruiser experience, which they have shut down. And this is part of my current project on play in theme parks and theme parks as socio-technical spaces. So what I have been doing all week is assembling my materials to head back into the field, which in this case has meant stickers in part.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, next to be telling me that you've been making badges to attach to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, basically.
Without giving away too many trade secrets, what do the stickers say?
They actually say so. This is the challenge, right? Because a big part of fan communities is often they're producing really incredible creative materials. So I had a real challenge here because I'm not a creative person. So it's like, what could I cobble together to appropriate? So one of the droids, I'm doing air quotes for visual, the droids on this Galactic Star Cruiser experience was a droid. And one of the things she said was, oh gosh, now I'm going to forget it. It's like, panicking does not help anything. So I've taken her image and I've just put that panicking does not solve anything. And I will hand those out.
For people of my age, there was a late 60s, early 70s British TV show called Dad's Army.
Okay.
Which was about reservists, gentlemen of a certain age, who were going to defend Britain against the German invasion during the war. And the head of this little unit, a very self-important martinet, who was the local bank manager, would say, "Don't panic."
Well, is that the origin of those posters that kind of popped up in the last, I was going to say 10 years, but honestly, it was probably 20 years ago, that said, "Don't panic"?
Probably. Captain Mannering, spelt Manwaring, would say, "Don't panic." And it is an expression that I love and that goes through my mind, to be honest, several times a week.
Yeah, it's a pretty apropos phrase. When I was rewatching videos of this droid, because I had interacted with it, I'm doing a lot of air quotes. So when I had interacted with it on the Star Cruiser, I hadn't quite keyed into that. But when I was rewatching videos, jotting down phrases that she said that might work, I was like, oh, that one is kind of perfect for right now.
Yeah. Well, if you need a shorter version for a very small sticker, you could try "Don't Panic" and Dad's Army. And if there are any British men or women in their 60s at the convention, they will glom onto you and tell you everything your ethnographic self needs to know.
Maybe I'll go back and do a second iteration of it. That is the wonderful thing about these little, I bought this little, it's called a Cricut machine, and it lets you just make all of your own stickers and vinyls. So it's this very again, I'm not a creative person, so it's an interesting challenge to be faced with this device that can do so much. But in terms of producing fanish things, it's pretty cool.
Wow, Cricut machine.
Yeah, I don't want to do this is not an ad. CRICUT.
Crick art.
It's Cricut, yeah.
Cricket, not the sport, but
not the yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, I'm looking at it. It looks weird. So,
yeah.
Okay. Now, tell us about this, I was going to say enterprise, unfortunate terminology in this context.
Fine.
This thing that I've not heard of before, I have to confess, that Disney once did and no longer does, and what that signifies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what it signifies. I mean, basically, what Disney did is they stood up a very expensive 2-day immersive experience. And of course, part of what they're playing on is this rise. I'm doing air quotes now again, rise of kind of popularized immersive or live action role play LARP entertainment. So this idea that you go into another space, another world. So you may already hear threads with some of my other work. You go into another world and you kind of live in that environment. And, Disney now owns, of course, the intellectual property of Star Wars. I mean, that is part of their stable. So they created this experience for you to go in and kind of do a kind of interactive theater, we'll say. And they ran it for, I guess it was almost a year or a little over a year. I got a chance to go before they shut it down. And so the thing I'm going to later this week is this, fan community that has sprung up that is going to do their own convention in honor, in love of this venture.
And they're not happy with Disney ending it, is
No.
that?
Very unhappy, very unhappy. And so there's been a lot of interesting fan attempts to now kind of revive the spirit or continue to sustain the spirit of that venture. And so this project I have on play in theme parks, I don't know. I hate writing, and so I always tell myself I'm never going to do another book, and then I suddenly see the shape of the chapters, and I can imagine there's a chapter here on this. And so the fan convention's an important part of this story somehow.
Have you been to them before, fan conventions of this kind?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say that's probably, I mean, even going back to my earliest work in the 90s on early virtual worlds, where those weren't called fan conventions. Those were usually just meetups of people who were spending a lot of time in online worlds together. So that idea, going to a convention, going to a meetup, I would say in some ways it's almost probably a trope or a crutch for me. It's something I always have as a part of my field work because so much of what happens either in online spaces or in these kinds of curated environments is some other component, is a space, a community space that people are usually creating for themselves.
Now, this brings me on to asking you about a book you co-edited that's path-breaking, Ethnography and Virtual Worlds. And I wondered if I could ask you in part about that book, and you've written about these topics quite a bit, but also perhaps what happens when there is this movement from meeting people online to meeting them physically.
Yeah, it's one of the things I love most. I would say, again, going back to my earliest work, but probably even captured in the title of my first book, which was Play Between Worlds, which was really about the ways in which people are always blending and crossing between these online and offline spaces. They're wonderful. I mean, they're complicated because, how people are known online and their personalities or what they're called by or the groups they have online, those can shift and ebb and change offline. But those offline spaces, when people do meet up, generally become powerful anchors for their experience back in online or other kinds of spaces. So, I mean, for me, one of the things I love about fan conventions or fan meetups is they just show the complexity and the passion people have to sustain their connection with each other, sometimes even in spite of what platforms allow. I mean, the Star Cruiser is a really interesting example, right? Of, you could think of it as a platform that closed, and yet fans have still managed to find ways to retain that connection and that affective pull, even though the company who authored it has essentially washed their hands of it.
There's a radio soap opera that the BBC makes called The Archers, which has been going for 60 years, maybe 70, and it's based in an imaginary little village. through the 90s and up until the middle, maybe 15 years ago, the BBC curated an online chat group for people to talk about this, and then ended it because they thought it cost too much. But really what that was about was that it didn't suit their demographic desires, because the listenership of this kind of program is pretty old. So they keep the show going, but they didn't want to dedicate any resources to this. And the sorts of people and the age they were at meant that creating something for themselves really wasn't much of an option. And that was partly about the technology of the time and partly about their age and the protests they got, because, you know, elders know how to make their voices heard, even if their voices don't count for very much with 30-year-old executives. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So I think it's very interesting when these corporations take a bit of a misstep, perhaps. And that leads me on to asking you, because you've gotten into the belly not only of the beast, as it were, of the fans, but you've also worked with Microsoft, for example, and also, as I understand it, with Twitch. So what's it like negotiating for you as an ethnographer, as a sociologist, as a participant, between the world of fandom or play or participation and the world of men or women in suits?
Yeah. I mean, I think for myself, we have so many really good and rich studies of fandom that I find that what I'm particularly interested in is when fandom sits in messy or heavily controlled regimes of governance, whether it's a game company that owns the platform, or in this case of this current project, Disney. I mean, if you think of one of the most heavily kind of commercialized, curated, invested corporate owners. So for me, in my field work, telling the story of fandom and that sort of emergent practice is really in conversation and a companion to telling the story of structural governance. Whether that's how companies are handling policy. I mean, so, you know, if you think of a company like Twitch and thinking really carefully about how are they understanding how they're going to govern their platform, what are their structures of ordering and control. When I did my old MMO work, it was on whether or not the game company thought people could really own their avatars and sell them. So I'm always interested in this other side, not just telling the emergent fandom practices, but the way they're often in tension with governance structures. In the current project I'm doing, that's meant, I would say probably in all my projects, I spend time at like industry conferences. So I was at the huge theme park convention where like all the people who are building theme parks go. I did 2 of those in the last year to see how those folks are talking about design, governance, structures. So I guess what I'm saying is, for me, tracing the corporate actors is just as important a part of the story as the dynamic, emergent fan stuff that it's so easy to, to kind of love in some ways.
No, I get that. And I'm thinking Laura Nader.
I'm also interested. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. No, please.
I'm thinking of Laura Nader 50 years ago talking about studying up, and one of your collaborators, George Marcus, talking about the need for multi-sited ethnography. But of course, it's slightly different in these cases because you are probably a desired creature in the eyes of fans, but you've clearly been a desired creature at some level in the eyes of Twitch and Microsoft, right? There's something in what you do that it's not just you want to study them because that's an important thing to do, but they want you to know about them at some level, and they want your wisdom, no?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned Laura Nader. I mean, this is studying up I teach a qualitative methods course, and this is one of the things I'm always encouraging students to think about tackling. It's actually one of the hardest things to do methodologically because, as we know, elites tend to keep pretty tight gates around their spaces.
Yeah.
The thing with Microsoft, I mean, the Microsoft thing is a little bit of the Microsoft connection comes from being in conversation with the folks in the social media collective, which are like you and I, academics and scholars. So that was the foot in the door there. I mean, I was fortunate then to, once you're in the door, I mean, it's like getting in the door is half of it. So of course, once I had those stints, I was able to go out and do field work at Microsoft and Redmond. So that's how that one came about. The Twitch one is complicated. I have a tendency to want to study things that are pretty offside and that a lot of people aren't looking at. And that's tended to mean I've gotten very lucky at studying things before they broke as mainstream media things. And I think when you do that, you get some credit from the internal stakeholders who are often themselves not yet legitimized. So when I did my Twitch work, that was in their early days. They were still figuring out their own legitimacy. An academic comes in, you're often seen as somebody who's bringing some legitimacy to the space. So I got to know a lot of people through that work. As is often the case, then you put out a book. I've had a lot of people in the field sites I've studied who are excited that the book has come out. I don't think they've ever read them because they're these scholarly works. So why would they? But they serve as a marker of legitimacy. And so then I think in turn, you kind of get sometimes brought in ways that you might. I don't know if that makes sense. The path
sure.
I'm tracing.
So the book you're talking about is Watch Me Play.
Yeah.
Which is terrific. And congratulations on that as on all your work.
Thanks.
Yes, no, that makes a lot of sense. They're looking for a certain legitimacy and they're not defensive. So it's not like something very established. Notoriously very hard to study Hollywood.
Yeah. And that happened with my esports book was much the same. I did that esports work before esports got super popular.
Right.
And that talk about a scene that really was wanting recognition. And I think it really mattered to people. And, it's hard. I mean, I hope I don't pull my punches too much in terms of my critical analysis of these spaces. But I will say with the Twitch one, the only asterisk I would add to this story is I served on their safety advisory council for several years, but that whole council essentially got short notice. So the ties of connection are sometimes precarious.
Now, the esports book called Raising Mistakes is a really interesting one. We're seeing lots of material, physical sporting teams, from baseball teams to English Premier League teams, creating esports elements as part of both wanting to make money, but also creating new groups of younger people who may then become profitable in terms of their following of the club in its ordinary work. If you could share a little bit about what you found about esports. The book is 3 or 4 years old now. Yeah.
Oh, it's 12 years old now.
Oh, my copy must be 3 or 4 years
old.
old.
Okay. Yeah, it came out in 2012, I think.
Okay. So that was very early days. Yeah. What sorts of things have happened since?
I think the biggest change that happened is when I even end that book saying, like, there had just been a kind of crash in the esports scene. And I end it basically saying, I don't think esports is ever going to go away, but this may be a very niche product. And two major things changed between when I finished that book and now. The first was Twitch, which was in fact why I started doing Twitch. You previously did not have a viable form of media distribution for esports. Most esports people were chasing television. That was not really shaking out in a meaningful way. It was very expensive to do online broadcasting. And with the advent of Twitch, it completely changed everything. It changed where people saw audiences. It changed the economics. It really had this profound. So that was a big one. In turn, in part because of that, esports got flooded with venture capital and tons of speculators. And so the period between my book and I would say maybe a year even so ago, no, maybe the period between, let's say, 2015, 2017 and now was one in which tons of VC speculation came in. Traditional sports organizations started looking exactly. You hit the nail on the head because they are terrified about losing audience and they keep thinking like, okay, how can we sustain audience in the face of shifting leisure appetites?
Right.
That has in part largely bottomed out now. So you actually see VCs who had invested getting out of the space. You increasingly see traditional sports organizations now dumping teams and getting out of the space. The soccer leagues in Europe were a very different success case for many years, and so I don't know. I haven't kept on top of what's happening in Europe with this, but in the U.S. we have hit another kind of burst of the balloon in esports. But I just want to plus one and highlight your point about creation of product. This is creation of audiences as products. And when that doesn't shape out the way people anticipate, the bottom starts dropping out of a lot of the funding.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see what Keynes called animal spirits at work. The way in which there is this, to use advertising speech, herd mentality of these morons with all these billions of dollars they're sitting on in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, but especially in Northern California, a little under half of joint venture capital of the world, as you know, who rush to spend money on something where there's no evidence that it'll work. And they do it not because they've engaged in rational evaluation of the sector, but because their boyfriends and girlfriends, mostly boyfriends, are doing it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating because I had a number. I often felt like is it Don Quixote in those the post years of my writing that book when I would meet all of these people, just, between being at MIT, which is this weird marker for people. So you get these cold calls and the book.
Yes.
And I would say to them, like, this is an overinflated market. This is not realistic. And they just did not want to hear it. Some of that is, I think, some kind of willful blind hypeness. Some of it, I do think, is the way a lot of venture capital is interested in coming in and kind of burning through orgs and then maybe flipping them. These were not meant to be. They were not sustainable. Nobody was actually thinking about sustainability.
I'm interested at the moment in academic fashion and running into things. And the headlong leap into artificial intelligence by academics who know nothing about it is unprecedented in my experience. I've never seen so many ignorant people pronounce themselves to be instant experts based on, I've no idea what.
I find it very distressing. I have to admit, I used to feel like, okay, well, I study games and play, and that already felt pretty offside to serious inquiry and scholarship. And I've now decided to study theme parks. And at a moment where everybody is running to study AI, I just feel like, oh boy. But yeah, it is. I mean, it's hard, right? Because part of it is the kind of precarity and hustle culture that has seeped into academia. And I think you've got a lot of folks who feel the pressures of that and the structural pressures of that. But it does bum me out. It does bum me out that.
Well, I've got news for you, which you don't need to hear. Theme parks may come and go, but they're not going to evaporate. And they're
They aren't.
And they're really
huge.
Interesting. They're really interesting.
Thank you for, I am at the point where I was just writing on my whiteboard. I'm always asking myself, why does this matter? What's at stake? Why does this matter? What's at stake? And I'm still grasping at the answer for that, but if nothing else, I can say these are spaces in which millions and millions of people go every year. They have all kinds of complicated and meaningful experiences in them, and
Sure.
they are exemplars of trying to live air quotes
Mm,
in a
mm,
highly curated commercialized
mm.
world. And I think I'm always interested in that tension space. It's just theme
Sure.
parks are like the hyper epitomization of that in some ways.
And can I ask you a slightly personal question, Prof, but it goes to
Yeah.
something you have published online, which is that entering academia as a student, let alone a prof, was a big jump for you,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
perhaps you were, in fact, a participant observer for quite a long time.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
felt like an outsider in class terms, I think. Is it okay to
Yes.
talk about that a wee bit?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm.
I think it's important we make class more visible
Hmm.
in some ways. Yeah. Yeah. I came from a working class family, first in family to go to college. My mom went back and graduated high school when she was an adult. I went to community college. I shock and joke with my students now that I never took the SAT for students for whom like perfect scores on SATs are probably not that unusual. I am
SAT is Scholastic Aptitude Test.
yes, yeah,
It's
a very common
one of the things that gets you into college in the United States.
exactly. So yeah, no, I think yeah, I mean when you class jump it probably you're coming prepackaged with some hyper alert antennae.
So people talk about it's a cliche, but I think often cliches are there because they really are quite meaningful. People talk about imposter syndrome.
Hmm.
Is there any sense in which, when you were in community college and thereafter, you felt like that, but you didn't when you were in the gaming world that has then become part of your academic presence?
Well, I mean, I think the wonderful thing about gaming fandom spaces is they're not tied to your work identity. I mean, most people don't walk around and ask others, "What do you do for a living?" Like most people work and then they have the rest of their lives that they're constructing a lot of meaning through. And so
Mm,
I perhaps that's part of why I have a lot of hobbies. I love leisure. Um yeah, there's something quite freeing about those. It can be I think it actually can be really disarming because I think many academics who live in middle class and up worlds get used to the world being organized in one particular way. So yeah, I mean, yeah. So I have to admit I never really thought about it in the way you just framed it, but it makes some sense that there's a little bit more ease when you're not on the back foot with your uh,
yeah, I mean, in terms
capital.
of things being a bit more open, a bit less, as you were saying, organized. When I'm living in Latin America, people say to me, why do you want to be here? You come from an organized society. And
Interesting.
it's their term or a term, particularly in
Yeah.
Colombia, people use for the global north. So thinking about this question of identity online, Prof, one of the conversations we had at least 20 years ago was about the fact that I think in those days, South Korea was maybe the only country where there were more women gaming than men, or it was close to
Mm,
50-50,
mm,
right? And that was particularly interesting because this had been seen as a sort of first-person shooter space,
mm.
very male-dominated, sort of guys who didn't wash and didn't shave and lived in their mother's cellars and whatnot, that stereotype, which is still there to a certain extent. But also, this was a time when people outside games were very utopic about online worlds, including email, that all these spaces, and this proliferated within so-called social media as well, would allow women in particular, but other groups that are oppressed in the everyday social world, to reinvent themselves and present themselves as they wished. a lot of that utopia has turned into dystopia.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
reasons that you'll be more familiar with personally than am I. So that's my sort of take on things. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say this for me is also what I try to leaven enthusiasm with emergent fan culture, which is that emergence isn't always the beautiful, the good, and the utopic. There's lots of sinister, nasty things that also emerge in fandoms and fan cultures. And so, yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things I've long been drawn to is, in my first book, one of the chapters is about women who play MMOs. And I was really interested in understanding how they did that, how they navigated it, given the barriers to entry, things like harassment, exclusionary. So I'm always interested in that tension of the possibilities of what these spaces can be and sometimes really are, and the way those things are often, modulated down by countervailing tendencies that are not terrific and are exclusionary. I mean, so it kind of circles back to the question you asked me about working with companies. One of the things I did a number of years ago, I'm no longer involved. I've handed off the reins, but I co-founded an organization to tackle diversity and inclusion in games, because one of the things we were really interested in was what can we learn from the people who are thriving and surviving there, the women, the people of color, the LGBTQ folks, and then what might companies need to do to sort of think about those lessons and do things better. So I think that tension has always been a part of what I explore.
Yeah, and this chapter is where the women are chapter.
Yeah.
In the book Play Between Worlds.
Yeah. And I tried to do that. I did with my esports project, even though men largely made up the esports scene. I tried to talk about the women who were there, who were surviving. And same thing with I always think, like we could learn a lot by figuring out how the people who are most pressed in the spaces are still managing to be there, are playing despite the structures.
And the last time I was briefly a visitor teaching at an expensive private college in the United States was 2 years ago. And in classes, which were they were almost all white, because they were nice Jewish girls, mostly from LA and New York. And they'd had extensive coaching. They had a lot of cultural capital. They were very able. And they did brilliantly in all the forms of evaluation. During class, the few boys in the class were doing betting on sports with their phones, and the girls were watching influencers talking about makeup and fashion. So because I didn't want to ban the use of phones in the class, my attempt to engage this was, I sort of didn't know what to do with the gambling on sports, because I just didn't know very much about it. But I did know a bit about influencers, and it was, as you know, it's an emergent and interesting field in terms of some of the imbalances in the number of women versus men who are influencers, but also in reverse, the remuneration they receive. There are very few men involved. They're well under 20% of influencers in the US, but they're paid a lot more money than the women, right? This is all well known. So I thought, I can get the girls to listen to me, or appear to be interested, if I engage them on this score. Couldn't give a fuck. Didn't matter. Because they knew how to write what professors wanted. They had that cultural capital.
Yeah.
You were talking about the fact that you confide in your students that you never did the SATs. I'm not asking you to denounce students in Denmark, where I think you were before, or MIT, but what's your experience of students who have particular forms of knowledge and expertise, and how to bring those into the classroom pedagogically, which was what I was trying to do but failed to do.
Yeah.
In my anecdote. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Well, it's a hard one, right? Because I think any of us who've been stuck trying to teach critical media studies to a range of student body. I mean, it's a tough one. I will say one of the things I feel really fortunate about now, and I'm sure you had this experience as well, is, you build up a reputation over time. And I teach electives. I teach courses people don't have to take. That's a huge luxury. In the past, I've taught required courses at other places. So now I teach electives. And so I think students who come into my class know from day one, here's the landscape, here's my vibe, here are the things that I'm going to be. So I think it's a structure. I mean, isn't it a structural? So often it's a structural challenge.
No, I mean, I take your point. And because I've been teaching introductory courses for many years now.
That's hard.
And nothing else. It's a different experience. I get
it's
it.
a whole different experience.
Because I'm going from country to country and school to school almost every year. I mean nothing to people.
Yeah. So no. But I can maybe one way to add though to what you're saying is I don't want to overstate it, but I do feel like we are in a moment a little bit of kind of, what was I going to call it, like platform resignation. Like I find students, they're not dummies. Like they actually know how the system works. They know that they're the product. But we are also in a moment where there's a ubiquity of platform life. And so it's a really interesting question. Like, what does it mean affectively? What does it mean for subjectivity to sort of, they know, and we kind of put it more in their faces. And it's like, well, what do I do now? Well, like there's an interesting,
Well, absolutely. To back up your point, 20 years ago, students in the United States that I had, both at a fancy school and a public university, were worried about online surveillance by the state. When I go back there now, they're worried about online surveillance by corporations.
Yeah.
Whereas that had to be something explained to them, and they were doubting.
Right. No, they know now.
Is that to your point?
It is exactly my point that they know, they get it. We also we swim in that water, and so it strikes me as a little bit of a meta question. Is like what does kind of, I don't want to say politics, but what does critical action look like in these moments for these students? I mean, when I came up. When I was an undergrad, I mean, it was, the 1980s, and there was a certain amount of financial precarity. I remember I did an undergraduate project on whether or not people thought they could actually own a home someday. The concerns were not actually all that different, but they are so amplified now on top of environmental devastation and political disenfranchisement. I think it's a hard question. What does that mean then in the classroom for us?
I mean, I found one way, and I'd be very delicate about this because I was a man, but when I was at this fancy school in the south of the United States a couple of years ago, was when Roe versus Wade, the big Supreme Court decision from 1973 that for 50 years instantiated privacy as a right under the Constitution, and hence led to abortion being legal, in inverted commas. Young women were talking about this all the time because they were living in a state that was going to make this illegal straight away.
Yeah.
And that would have been a way in for this, but I was chary of doing it because of what I am.
Sure. Of course. I mean? No, I do. Absolutely.
It's interesting when we fantasize that, in a sense, the seminar or the lecture theatre is a place where it's safe to say anything. But our subjectivities do matter, don't they?
Absolutely.
Getting on to that, I wanted to ask you more at an academic level and less about my incredibly exciting career. At what point do you say to students, I've been a gamer for many years, I'm inside these groups, I do ethnography, often of what is part of me anyway. Is that part of credentializing at some level? Ugly word to use.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, pretty clear about talking about my own projects, but I will say in the last few years, I've started to wonder how much longer I can teach my games and culture course, because the truth of the matter is I don't keep up in the same way I used to. The genres of games that are popular are not generally my genres of preference. You know, there are genres in games. So I do, it's an interesting question what it means to age out of teaching a domain course. I mean, I don't know about you. I certainly remember, I don't know if I took any, but I certainly have in my mind an imagination of you take a course on television and all of the examples are only from X number of years. Like, maybe that's okay, but at some level, like not being able to be conversant with the students in the domain. I don't know. So I've been thinking about this a lot.
Can you teach Madonna?
Right? And we all have those moments where we realize, like, oh my God. Like we watched a very old Maggie Smith just died. So we watched my partner and I watched an old Agatha Christie movie from 1982, I think. And we had this moment where we were like, oh wait, that's like 40 something years ago. And then musing like, wait, so in 1980, if I heard adults talk about something from 1940, would I have even remotely paid attention? And did they? I don't know. So yeah, I don't think you have to stay contemporary, but with something like games, it is an interesting question if you can.
Yeah, no, point taken. Point taken. And Prof, I wanted to ask you a question about, in a sense, academic disciplines and so on. I was fortunate enough recently to recall one of these conversations with another old friend, Mia Consalvo, whom I also hadn't seen since, I don't know, Bill Clinton was president or something, roughly. And I was very interested in preparing for that, to read a piece in which, I think co-written with someone else quite recently, they'd evinced a certain annoyance at the status of, for crude purposes, let's call it game studies, thin communication and media studies more generally, that the contributions that game studies, in inverted commas, could make to communication and media studies were being ignored by hegemons of the larger field, as it were. And that this was a legitimate subfield, but it wasn't going to touch them. It's a bit like saying, we better have a queer theorist, but that won't affect what I do. Do you know what I mean? Or we better have X category of person, but I'll still do what I do. I wanted to ask you about that issue. I hope I'm doing Mia and a service at their argument.
So I will agree, but I will add one more beat to it. So I agree. I think I wrote a piece now, but a couple years ago, maybe, called Games Matter. It's a really short piece. And it was my like, oh my God, will all you people who care about platforms please look at games? Like, because there's all this work on critical internet studies and platforms. And I was like, you're missing at every turn, or on moderation, or on governance and platforms. So I share that sentiment that the lessons that those of us who have studied games have tried to convey have just not been picked up. They are not seen as part of the conversation. And I think that's incredibly unfortunate, because I would say you find in games things that happen way before they kind of go mainstream. So you get a lot of like canary in the coal mine detection. But they also are a part of our most important cultural conversation. So I think, yes, I completely agree that communication, media, sociologists, anthropologists, all of them are ignoring gaming it's a disservice. At the same time, I will say, game studies has perhaps not resisted the urge to carve itself as a special domain. I think it's really important we try to put ourselves in conversation with some of those broader issues or thematics. Or when I did the Twitch book, I did the Twitch book once I had gotten here to MIT, and I'm situated in a comparative media studies department. And so I felt like, well, can I write this in a way that really tries to be in conversation with this new community that I'm in? And, you know, it's imperfect, and I'm not a media scholar. I'm a sociologist primarily, but I tried to put it in those conversations. So I think game studies, we could do more of that. And I worry that game studies has also gotten a little bit looped into recreating the wheel over and over again. Like, whether it's a genre fixation or it's yet another close read of XYZ. I just think there's sometimes a little bit too much interiority to the field. So I'm yes-anding.
Yeah. No, beautiful. Thank you, Prof. I have one more question for you, which is to ask you about your experience of teaching in Northern Europe versus the US, because it's unusual to have gone from the US to Northern Europe and then back. And then I'd like to throw things to you to conclude matters by offering you the space to add anything. And that might mean something entirely new that we haven't mentioned, or it might mean going back to something we have discussed where you want to say a bit more. So first thing, can you tell us about the experience of moving from a predominantly English language country to a country where everyone can speak English, but that's not the principal mother tongue, as it were, and that world, and then returning? What was that like for you?
Well, I mean, it was an amazing experience, and I would just, nod back to the working class roots. I certainly never imagined that would be a part of my experience living and working abroad. That was unfathomable to me. It was a great experience. I would say it was, as a teaching experience, in some ways quite different and quite similar to what I have now. It was different in the sense that it was a graduate-only program, and after the first couple that came through our program wanted to be game designers. So, that was, it's an interesting thing. Maybe this goes back to your question about teaching slightly, where I was wanting to have a critical conversation about gender and gaming, and my students were guys who just wanted to make a game of a particular sort. So that was, but I would say actually the most different teaching experience I had was not between Denmark and the US. I mean, in some ways, the student body of Denmark and MIT are more homogeneous than heterogeneous. Like they were all roughly at the same level. Different, of course, demographic backgrounds, but the kind of baseline level in which I was working, which was really different than when I taught at NC State my first 3 years, which was a big state school. You had a lot of different folks in that classroom of different and varying levels. When I adjuncted, I taught at UMass Boston. So in some ways, for me, those were the more different experiences than here. Of course, there's other things too, like in the Nordics. You're not, the grading is very different, and there are many different things. But yeah, that teaching grad students who wanted to do game designs, that was a really particular cohort.
And it does sound as though class travels.
Yeah,
it?
Right. You can't shake your own biography. I see and feel and know.
Not just your biography, but their international elite forms of being, forms of life. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
So to bring things to a close, Prof, I wondered if there were things that you might like to add.
No, I will say, Toby, I've always appreciated that you have always had a place for gaming in your scope of what counts as important work. And that was, I will say, especially valuable to me, encouraging of the projects. And I think, it's that is the model I hope we get to, where media scholars just take this as part of our cultural milieu that we need to be on top of and informed about. And no, yeah. I mean, I hope we get more work that is studying up. Hope we get more work that is studying leisure. You know, the UK has a really good tradition of leisure studies. I don't think we have that in the same way here, and it would be great if we did. So yeah, no, I guess that's about it, probably.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thanks.